Coming up on today's episode of the Salesman Podcast.
As a salesperson, I want to present my prospect with an irresistible offer where they have no choice but to say yes to hiring Michael Veltri. And in Jiu Jitsu, we're faced with that irresistible offer, whether we're receiving it or giving it, when we find ourselves in a position where we have to tap.
Hello, Sales Nation. I'm Will Barron, host of the Salesman Podcast, the world's most listened to B2B sales show. If you haven't already, make sure to click subscribe. And with that, let's meet today's guest.
Hi, I'm Michael Veltri, keynote speaker and trainer for sales teams and sales meetings. You can find me at michaelveltri.com.
On this episode of the show, the legend that is Michael, we're diving into how Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu can teach us to become better sales professionals, why being full contact in our training is incredibly important, the importance of having a system to selling, and a whole lot more. So let's jump right in. Michael, tell us what Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is, and then we can dive into how it relates to business.
Sure, you bet, Will. So it's very interesting because it's actually Japanese Jiu-Jitsu that was exported to Brazil way back in 1914. And one of the unique things I love about it is that the Brazilians took this Japanese form of grappling. Jiu-Jitsu is made up of two Japanese characters actually meaning gentle technique. So it's not a striking art where you're punching and kicking, but it's primarily a ground grappling like wrestling where you learn as a smaller person to control a bigger person. That might be through the use of body pressure, joint locks, or even choking techniques. So the Brazilians took Japanese Jiu-Jitsu and innovated beyond belief and then spread it worldwide to this amazingly popular mixed martial arts, MMA and BJJ Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu that we now hear about today.
So we'll get onto the branding of things and how they perhaps spread it and the messaging a little bit later on. But sure. I've got a whole bunch of thoughts on this, but I don't want to put words in your mouth, Michael. How the heck does this martial art, where essentially it's a bunch of men and women in dressing gowns on the floor strangling each other, how does this translate into business and kind of sales success?
Sure. So there's a lot of different ways to go with this. One of the things that I like, again, as a salesperson myself, and what I see with a direct connection with Jiu-Jitsu is something that I call the irresistible offer, Will. So as a salesperson, I want to present my prospect with an irresistible offer where they are they have no choice but to say yes to hiring Michael Veltri. And in Jiu-Jitsu, we're faced with that irresistible offer, whether we're receiving it or giving it, when we find ourselves in a position where we have to tap out, where we're caught, where there's no way out, where every window has been closed, every escape, whether that's somebody catching me in a position where I tap. And for our listeners, a tap means that you submit, that you give the sale, that you give something to somebody else. And when you're applying your technique to somebody, you're closing every window for them to escape, where you give them the irresistible offer where if they don't tap, they're going to lose out. They can get injured or hurt. So one of the things I like to equate is that showing when we train in Jiu-Jitsu, whether we're being submitted and having to tap, or learning how to apply that submission to somebody else, is like in sales, learning how to create an irresistible offer to our prospects.
Just to add a layer on this, I've never really thought about it like this before. When you're in the position, and this happens to, I assume far less for you, Michael, than it does for me. But when I'm getting, caught up, triangled, strangled, whatever it is, there's a point where you have to make a decision, right? There's a point where it's a binary choice of you're gonna needlessly hurt yourself, you're gonna go unconscious, or you tap and you give up. And I guess the whole point of sales, in the analogy that we're driving here, is to get to a binary decision. And I like the way you aligned it there of you're cutting off, not necessarily cutting off all the other escapes, because we're not trying to push people down a pathway that they don't want to go down, but we are trying to influence people towards a binary decision, and it's their free wills whether they decide to go down that route or not. But another layer on this, which I've talked about on the show a million times, is the fact that until I started training jiu-jitsu, I would have, I've been selling for a long time, a relative long time. I'd still have a little bit of rejection, not necessarily phobia, but I'd feel it. Someone slams that phone down on me. Someone tells me I'm an idiot. Someone rejects whatever proposal. I think it's an irresistible offer. Getting strangled 3 or 4 times a week and giving up on it really let me let go of that rejection, because I realized that it doesn't really matter, right? It's one thing to have some big burly dude on your back, or occasionally some skinny girl strangling you from the front. That is real life, right? That's a literal potential threat. And did you feel this translates? Do you feel the same way that in sales we make the rejection, the threat level, the adrenaline, that's higher than what it should be? And I find that Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu levels it and makes it more of what it should be, which is a bird chasing after you, or physically being attacked.
Yeah, and that's such a great point, Will, because that leads me to not only agreeing with what you said, but to get to that point, you can practice drilling, for example, in jiu-jitsu, drilling 1,000 arm bars, drill, this, that, the other. And then when you have to apply it in a live sparring session, a live rolling session, and a million things go wrong, and you really see if your technique works or not, you need those full resistance sessions to get better. Much like you can practice your sales pitch over and over and over. Then you get in front of a real live human being who tells you to go F off, or get out of there, or humiliates you, or is just a jerk, or they had a bad day, or they're testing you. And if you at that point you crumble because all you've done is you've never had live resistance to your technique, your sales technique, your marketing technique, your jiu-jitsu technique. So yes, I love the fact that in jiu-jitsu, it's one of the few martial arts where you go at it full on, really without worrying too much about getting hurt or hurting somebody. Like, I love all martial arts, and I did karate for many years, but if I try to punch somebody full on as hard as I can, I might hurt them. I can't do it as much as jiu-jitsu. So yes, we practicing on the mats full resistance allows us, when we have to do full resistance in the boardroom or in a big sales conference or in a big sales pitch. So when our technique doesn't work as we thought it would, and they don't take our irresistible offer, that it's a practice of self-awareness, of humility. Man, that's one of the things I've learned the most, and most, Will, is humility. Because I've had those little small people, male and female, choke me out. Mm-hmm. Humility and patience. Those two things translate exquisitely from the mats to our sales processes.
So if sales translates to full contact sparring, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, what does marketing translate to as a martial art, where there's a bunch of people with, and obviously I'm playing a stereotype here, with thick rimmed glasses, cappuccinos in their hands, sat in an office, not actually speaking to anyone in particular?
Yes. Well, that's a real good question. So I see it a couple different ways. I notice, and in jiu-jitsu competition, before we even touch hands or start, we're already marketing. We're either presenting ourselves a certain way, or presenting ourselves a different way. We're marketing ourselves one way or another. So much so that I've noticed some of the black belts that when they're training on the mats and they have 20 years and they have those 3 or 4 white stripes on their black belt, when they go to competition, Will, they wear a brand new black belt. So those other black belts don't know how long they've been training. So they're marketing themselves one way. So how does that translate into the real world? Well, that's a good question. I think it all comes down to, are you getting the results you want? Right? You're going to find out right away if your marketing material is effective or is not effective, if it's producing the results you want. Much like I'm going to find out if my technique is working, if I get the results I want. So simply saying, do I get the results I want from the marketing? And if not, what am I going to do to improve it? Just like when I was, I'm learning. I mean, I'm a black belt now in jiu-jitsu. I've been training for 12 years. I marketed myself one way that didn't work, and I evolved. I innovated. However, I had to, and you can relate to this. You have to market and play your own game. I'm tall and thin. I can't pretend I'm, 200-pound monster that does this. I have to market myself and ultimately be true to myself. So I think that's another way of saying it is the way you train on the mats. You can't pretend to be a Gracie if you're not a Gracie, that body type or certain type. Likewise, if your marketing is trying to make your product or service into something it isn't, it's going to fail. So I guess that's one way of saying is it allows you to try and get your marketing to be as authentic as possible, because it's not going to work.
You actually give me a far better answer than what I was expecting there, because I don't think I asked a very good question. What I was getting at was, if Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu translates to salespeople on the front line, full contact, are marketers doing Aikido? Are they doing karate? What? There's probably a little bit more validity to karate, but what bullshit martial art are marketers doing when they're sat there acting all fancy but not actually selling anything?
Oh my goodness. So okay, that is, I did give you a much longer answer. Well, because I do have a place close to my heart for those marketers. Maybe it is, right? Maybe it is presenting something that's not going to be effective. Maybe a bit of Tai Chi in them. Maybe what once was a great martial art on the battlefields of China has now become something that's fluff.
Fair enough. I'll take that. Anything to do with
fluff.
Anything to do with chakras, and I'm out. I'm out of there. I'm gone. So with that, then, and you kind of touched on it then, which is where I wanted the conversation to go to. You mentioned the Gracies. Clearly a family that invented jiu-jitsu. There's the UFC, which everyone has heard of, and there's Conor McGregor, which if you haven't heard of the UFC, you probably heard of him as a celebrity. I don't think people realize that the UFC was essentially a marketing ploy for the Gracie family. They created it, they won the first few of it, and the whole scheme behind it was to get Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Gracie Jiu-Jitsu in front of more people so they could open more schools and popularize it. So what can we learn from the branding side of it, and especially the personal branding side of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu?
Yeah, again, what I really like, and I mentioned this early on, is the innovation. If you are not innovating, you're going to become the technology of the past if you're not innovating. And one of the things that I absolutely love about the Gracies is that how they innovated when they first started training in 1916 to what they're still doing now in innovation. So how they brand, they're always innovating themselves, showing how, and if you think about this now, Will, how not only it was always based upon how a smaller person, how a weaker person can defend themselves, can have self-confidence, self-esteem. But now look at what they have done. It attracts everybody. People that, the big tough guys who would never think about doing a martial art, are signing up to it. So I see what they've done as far as branding, that is the constant, what we say in Japanese, the kaizen, that they're always improving, that they're always innovating, that they're not resting. And think about how that translates to their jujitsu, right? The techniques, berimbolo, or this 50-50 guard. There's always things that are coming up that are being innovative because of that full resistance training. If it doesn't work, we're going to know right away. So, what I love, again, what the Gracie's done, and they've stumbled, right? They sold the UFC for pennies compared to what it's going for now. But they're continuing to innovate, and they are the premier jiu-jitsu family in this amazing area that we occupy. And
it's the narrative, right? I know, can't think of his name now, I'll lose it. Japanese MMA fighter. It'll come back to me in a minute. It doped out of his mind on steroids anyway from that kind of era. Changed his name to Gracie, and they essentially bullied him into changing his surname back into whatever it was because they were so protective of their brand, and they wouldn't let him train with the Gracie gyms and the Gracie family unless he changed his name back to whatever it was prior. So there's an element of being really staunchly proactive in your personal branding, which is something I see salespeople not doing effectively at the moment. People are far too happy to spam cold emails and to do shady things when your LinkedIn profile, whether you like it or not, is going to be with you now for the next decade until the next thing comes along and wipes it out. So how important is it for us to control both our personal brand and the narrative behind our brand? How important is it for us to write our own story rather than just accept it from other people from a branding and business standpoint?
It's so great. So looking at the martial arts analogy, you're right. Gracies are synonymous with jujitsu. And even, myself having been exposed to them in the early, like they did in 1993 or 4 when that first UFC came out, my image is one of integrity, of hard work, of honor, of history. And so I think it's incredibly important as salespeople. People buy people. They don't buy our products and services. Ultimately, we want them to buy our products and services, but they're gonna take our phone call. They're gonna listen to us because of the person that's showing up in front of them. And yeah, make no mistake about it, Will. We have to be able to control who we are digitally, physically, verbally when we're on the phone or doing a podcast when it's a combination of everything. So it's incredibly important. And if salespeople aren't doing that, the first thing I do when I have a new opportunity is I go to LinkedIn. I find out who I'm going to be talking to, and I know everyone does it for me too. So I think that's a huge tool that people can automatically make. So we're leading the charge on how we're being branded, much like when we first start jiu-jitsu, our personal branding is we're being led everywhere by these advanced belts. We've got no choice. So, how can we be a black belt in our personal narrative right away? By taking the center, by showing people who we are authentically, right? That's the other thing too, is we can't pretend to be somebody that we're not. Much like I said earlier, you have to in jiu-jitsu, play the game that's suited for your body type, your mentality. So it's incredibly important. And that is a great tool for salespeople to take advantage of is take the initiative to brand yourself and really embrace your brand as you're putting it out there to your prospects and customers and clients.
So something that is a bugbear for me, and you can give me your thoughts on this, Michael, is the fact that compared to pretty much anything, if you're trying to learn piano, a martial art, jiu-jitsu, whatever it is, there's a system, right? There's a ladder of progress. There's a way of doing things. There's a best practice. Most sales training sucks. There is none of that. Most of it is either a one-off event or it's a book that people half read and don't implement, and then I fall for this myself. Of you think that you know better than industry standard practices, and you try and invent things when you should just be doing what works over and over. And clearly, that is a systemized path. Is this something? Am I off on the rails here, going the wrong direction, or is this something that we should learn from martial arts in general? That sales very easily can be systematized, and we should be thinking in a systematic way as we're selling.
Oh my gosh. Well, one of the things I wrote preparing for your show is basics are best. It's like, think about, our jujitsu training, right? I learn a bunch of techniques, but even now as a black belt, I still do armbar. I still do triangles. I still do basic chokes, rear naked chokes. The basics work, and they work for a reason. They have a high percentage of success. So the same thing in our sales. If you stick to the basics, right, you still have to do your prospecting. You still have to do great presentations. You still have to do follow-up. There's a system. There's a basic system. You don't need to, chase after the latest and greatest technique that's going to transform your life. Because it's not, you just like in the mats, right? There's no substitution for mat time. We were talking earlier, you said 3 days a week you're training, 1 day of open rolling later. That's how we got to put in the time. The basics, keep to that system, and the basics work great.
And on that front, and I've never really thought about this before, I train 3 times a week, and then hopefully one open mat, which is a couple of hours where I get to roll with the black belts and everyone on the way down from that. That's probably more sales training. That's probably more training than anyone does in sales training, even though jiu-jitsu is a hobby and sales is, I don't want to say my life, but pays for everything else, right? So is there a cadence of how often we should be sales training? Because it seems like it should be as often, if not more often, than a hobby that doesn't really, it's enjoyable and it's, a life skill and I get to hang out with cool people, but it doesn't really pay the bills or mean anything at the end of the day, if that makes sense. Should we be training?
Yeah.
Should I be training more on sales and should everyone else be than what the average person does when they train jiu-jitsu?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great analogy. Seeing how much time we spend actually training in jiu-jitsu to hopefully avoid any type of severe conflict, but then also having the confidence knowing to handle it. So I even think of, what I do, running my own business. I constantly make time for some type of training of myself, at least some type of sales training, at least once a week for me. So that could be reading some material. I try to go to some type of third-party live sales event at least once a quarter. So where I'm going somewhere. So it's very interesting because, yes, I remember my time in corporate America working for big companies. Maybe we had an annual sales kickoff, right, where we got some stuff that was useless jammed down our throat. Maybe there was a quarterly sales meeting where it was a lot of posturing to make yourself look good in front of your spirit. But that's a really good thing. I'd be curious to see what your listeners are like. What are they doing, right, to train? Now, listening to the podcast, this is a great way, hopefully, that they're training, that they're learning new techniques. And this is one of the things I do is I listen to podcasts like yours to try to learn and train myself. So I think it's incredibly imperative that sales professionals are getting some type of regular training to continue to stay sharp. Otherwise, we become lackadaisical. We become complacent. And complacency is the death of all good salespeople,
I think there's just to put my spin on the training element of this, and people can take it for what it's worth, but I feel like sales is like learning a language where you've got to be in the thick of things. You've got to be, if you're learning German, you want to be in Berlin, surrounded by people speaking the same language. And that's what I feel the podcast is. That's something you can tune into every day. Even if you're on your commute, you're probably 3/4, kind of 8/10 listening to the show. You're not kind of fully committed. Most people probably aren't making notes, or they're at the gym, or they're driving to work, or they're commuting. So that covers that ground. I still think you need that systematic level of training laid on top of the podcast. So hopefully this is a great first step. And obviously I want the audience to continue listening, and hopefully they're getting a ton of value out of these episodes, especially this one with you, Michael. But I do feel like there's another level to it, which is that systematic training, which, as you just alluded to, I never had either in any of my sales roles. I think I had one dude, I can't remember his name now. He's a local Yorkshire sales trainer. He came out with me in the field in medical devices for 2 days. Wasn't all that useful. He told me perhaps it was useful and I was too stubborn to listen, but he told me what I already knew rather than kind of anything revolutionary or anything tactical that could be put into my diary and be done each day. And that was about it. I had my sales manager just come out with me, but that was more of, it wasn't even coaching. That was just them making sure that I wasn't skiving, I think, more than anything else. So there's always a weird kind of, or potentially is a weird conflict there between salespeople and sales managers. So yeah, that systematized training, I think, is incredibly valuable. I don't think we get enough of it. And I've never thought about it like that, but that really goes to show that even I, hosting this podcast, probably spend dedicated, like for example, me, obviously all I'm doing is talking about sales, but marketing, I probably train more jiu-jitsu than I do marketing. And obviously marketing is important to getting this message out there. So that's a real call to arms for me and something I need to ponder on. Something else on this is the systematized progress as well. So you get a belt. I'm a white belt, get strangled by everyone. Yeah, you get a blue belt, probably get strangled by a few less people, but still pretty much get strangled by everyone. And you go up through the ranks, right? Is there any way that we can implement that into, perhaps now we're talking about a sales team where we have other people supporting other people, you have professors or coaches kind of passing down their knowledge. Is that something that we should be focused on as well?
Wow. Like what you just shared about your time in medical device sales, we would hope that it was more of the exception than the rule, Will. That I remember some of the sales teams I was on where what you just described existed, where you had, say, your GM of your channel, you had your regional managers, your sales manager and your teams, and they all worked together. One was training the other, just like you have that black belt helping everyone, brown belts, purple belts, blue belts, and even senior white belts. And I know when I was in a situation like that, where I could go to people with questions, and they wanted to help me. In other words, it was a selfless team. And I noticed that in jiu-jitsu. The people that stay and advance are selfless, because you cannot learn without giving and taking. Just much like the great sales teams I've been on and been with. The leadership has given back so much, whether that's in their time, their coaching, sharing their systems. Will anyone, like if I knew my sales friend Jeff was the best at, I don't know, follow up. I'm like, how can he follow up with all the stuff we have to do? And he would say, hey, Michael, this is what I do. Here, this is exactly the system I use. And he shared it with me because he wanted me to be successful. Those type of people are ultimately going to be more successful than if you try to hold it in or don't use anything. So I think it's incredibly important. You know what? And even if you do it for your own selfish success by being selfless, right? Wrap your mind about that. Like selfishly, I always wanted to get to blue belt, and then purple, then brown, then black. And the way I achieve my selfish goals is by being selfless.
How does that translate in B2B sales from the perspective of, let me put another angle on it. This is a belief. I've got no data to support this, whatever. And I'm not religious. I don't believe in karma or anything like that. But my belief is that if I go and help 10 people, 9 of them won't give a shit and give anything back. One of them will give more than 10 times the results that the effort that I've put in, if that makes sense. So I always feel that over the long term, I'm always net positive, whether it's helping doing consulting calls for free, whether it's giving people access to software or helping them out with different things, or just answering questions. And my email is full of people who are always emailing. My email is relatively open. It's will@salesman.org. Anyone can email me, ask questions, and I'll spend 20 minutes on an email and I'll get nothing back. Maybe I've made an effort. Maybe I've made an impact on that person's day. I've no idea because they haven't replied. But out of 10 emails, I'll get 1 email back, which is worth a ton of value to me.
Yeah.
Is there any logic in that? Is there any rules? What do you have any beliefs that kind of mirror that?
I do.
How does that kind of mirror to you, Michael?
Well, for millions of years, if not longer, that we've been evolving as human beings, we haven't survived by ourselves. We've had to rely on others and the group and sharing and giving. So I think, Will, there is an innate, I don't call it a yearning or something that we have just been created with to help others, to give for our own survival. So I don't know about you, I'm sure there's some people that are a bit, that may not feel this way, but when I help somebody else of my own free will, I feel good. I feel better. I feel like I've contributed. I just feel better. I like doing it. Now, of course, right, I have to manage my time. I can't just say I'm going to help others for all day and not make my sales numbers or whatever. But I just feel good doing it. And you're right. Maybe if 10%, 90% I won't hear back from, but 10%, well, that's what I do from the stage, man. I'm on stage talking, and I model the way I talk and teach from all the horrible sales meetings I've been in when I didn't learn anything and it was just irrelevant and it sucked. So I know I give to audiences of thousands, and I won't hear back from 90% of them or even more. But that one person that comes back to me and says, Michael, oh my gosh, I'm going through a tough divorce too. What you shared with me about when you went through a divorce and how you got through that to help your professional career is great. So I just think, man, we are built as human beings to want to help somebody. And I know when I do, I feel better. So you know what? If you want to feel better, help somebody.
So that's a good way of putting it. And having said that, that's actually really interesting because there is a lot of data on tribal relations and how our brain's structured and how we can only remember so many names. But then women more so than men, or more people with more feminine energy, perhaps is another way of putting it. To be politically correct, I don't know why I'm being politically correct on my own show, but people with more female energy, they tend to gossip more because they can't remember so many names, but they're based in the tribal environment. There's a ton of data on all of that. So perhaps there is data I can tie to it as opposed to just a kind of a whimsical belief that I have. And with that, I've got two final things I want to go through. One, something that we kind of touched on but then moved away from, was the fact that if you're getting choked unconscious, you tap, you reset, you go back at it. That's a good way to think about sales. Of you get rejected, you tap out, you have a cup of tea, you get back on with it, and it's just a game, right? No one's dying in jiu-jitsu, in a friendly club, and in sales. But then there's another element to it as well, of not giving in. So there's certain occasions where you may feel like this is the moment, I've got to tap. And for me anyway, it's more of an instinctual thing as opposed to a conscious thing of you do an escape. You get out of the armbar, you do the running man, you do whatever it is. How does that translate to sales? Because there's plenty of data on this as well, that salespeople don't follow up often enough, whether it's many times, or they don't follow up after they've been rejected. How does it translate to sales of we perhaps shouldn't give in as easily as what we sometimes do?
Yeah. So a couple things. One of the things that I've learned in continuing to train even now is that I've been pushed to see beyond my limits. Okay, so there's a limit we know where we're going to pass out or our arm's going to break if we don't tap. But then there's those times where you just got somebody on side control on you, and you think you want to tap because they're crushing you, but there's it's no pain, it's just discomfort. It sucks under there, and you want to tap, but you don't. You're taught to go beyond your limits and to hang in there and to push and push and push. Now, of course, right, there comes a time when you're caught. And what I take from every tap, and even as a black belt, I still get tapped, not as much, but and then I say to myself, what can I learn from this? What can I learn from this client saying no to hiring me? What can I learn from this? So that's how I look at it. I look at it as a wonderful opportunity. Oh my God, I didn't get the sale. Okay, what can I learn? What I got triangled again. What can I learn from this? I got knee barred again, so what can I learn from that? As recently, right, like John Danaher in New York, his whole leg locking system is, and leg locks have been around forever, but it's been a revitalization. What can I learn from getting heel hooked? What can I learn from that? What can I learn from getting rejected? So two things that I see is jiu-jitsu translating into what we want our sales friends to learn is to go past your limits, not to give up, to show that, hey, you can keep doing this even if it's uncomfortable. And the second thing is, when you do get that no, what can you learn from it, right? I don't just get pissed off at that guy that arm barred me. I'm like, oh, okay, all right, I see what you did there, and hopefully I won't get caught that way again. And if I get that no, and I've done that, right? Like I've been a little too aggressive, a little too quick in presenting myself as a speaker. The client didn't like it, and I got tapped. I got a no, but I learned about that. There's I found in my business, I have to use the here kitty kitty approach, right? If I jump too soon, the cat's going to run away. But if I'm here kitty kitty, I can get it. And, in my jujitsu sometimes too. Sometimes, you go right for the kill and it works. Other times you got that squirrely opponent. You got to bait them, invite them in, and then get them. So I learned something from every no I get as a salesperson. I learned something likewise from every yes I get. So those are my two thoughts, right? We're learned to go beyond what we think our limits are. And then even when we do get the no, just ask yourself, okay, what can I learn from this no?
So something interesting here, a specific point of that process. How do we know, both if we're being attacked in jiu-jitsu or in business, sales, and life in general, Michael, and we'll wrap up with this, mate. How do we know discomfort, being uncomfortable, which we can push through, how do we separate that from our limit or death or the end of the road? Because there's obviously, it's probably a gradual transition from one to the other rather than a binary, right? And I feel like people who can spend more time in uncomfortable positions tend to do better overall, and they raise their level of ability to deal with discomfort and stress and everything else as well. So how do we know when we are at that limit, when we should tap out? And how do we know when we should perhaps just push along a little bit further?
So two things come to mind when you say that. One is experience. There's no substitution for doing it. Um, you know, it just you've got to get out there. You've got to start somewhere. And think about your first class. I can't remember how you got started, Will, but right, you just got to get out there and try it. So I think experience starts to show you more of what you can handle. But the second critical part of experience is having others help guide you. Right? Think about in your class, you have so many other people to help guide you and show you and tell you, whoa, 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 you got to tap there, because right, there are some people that have the opposite problem. They don't give up, right? They stay in there until their arm's broken or until their ankle pops, and that's no good either. But they have others to help them. And as salespeople, maybe we're type A, aggressive, big ego people that maybe don't want to play well with others. But the most successful people I know have had others help to reflect to them, hey, this, that you're at your limit, or hey, you can go a little farther, push yourself a little more. So I would say, if you're listening to this podcast and you're a sales team of one, what can you do to get a mentor? Who else can you have to help guide you, who can be your professor? Who can be your sales professor? Who can be your sales coach? What does your sales academy look like? If you don't have one, there's tons of ways you can create one so you can see your limits and you can see how to go past your limits. So experience and others, those two things I think, Will, are paramount in making sure you don't get hurt and also making sure you continue to go past what you think you can do.
I've got one more layer to this. So I don't necessarily do this in jiu-jitsu, especially training. There's no point. Maybe in a competition, this would be my mindset. But in business, wherever I'm selling or creating content or whatever it is, I'm getting towards the end of the day. I'm starving. It's 9 p.m. I don't want to do anymore. I ask myself the question. I've mentioned this on the show loads of times. I just said the question, what would a champion do? If it's at the point where a champion goes, okay, well, you're fatigued. It's going to affect the next day's training. It's fine to stop and recuperate. If the champion would shut up and get on with things and make a few more calls, then that's what I do. And that question tends to like crystallize and make a rational decision whether to stop or to carry on, rather than emotionally getting wrapped up of Game of Thrones is on tonight, I've got to get back to watch that, or there's this going on, or I could get back for another training session at jiu-jitsu, whatever it is. And so that's the question I always ask myself. Is there any questions or mantras or anything that you have running through your head during the day?
One of the things similar to that, but I like yours better. It's similar. What would have to be true for this to be the best option? So what would have to be true for Game of Thrones to be the best option? Well, maybe it's 10 o'clock and I've hit my quota or anything like that. What would have to be true for, staying and working for another 3 hours to be the best option? Well, maybe my 5-year-old is in bed and my fiance is exquisitely taken care of. So, I like your question a little bit better. I might have to use that in some of my my talks. But that's one thing that I ask myself: what would have to be true for this option to be the best choice? And then I then it to death, Will. If I make 10 more calls, then I got a good chance of getting one more sale. If I go have a few more beers, then I might, not be able to train tomorrow, things like that.
Makes total sense. And feel free to use it because I robbed it from someone else and I have no idea who I pinched it from. It's someone on the show in one of the early episodes. So yeah, with that, I've got 2 final questions for you, Michael. Well, the final question, but I'm going to ask you a jiu-jitsu version of it, and then we'll go into the one that I usually ask everyone that comes on the show. So if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu faster?
I think for me, it comes down to patience. I can be patient in some things, but I like to see results. And as you know, Will, in this art, the results don't come overnight. I am very stubborn, and that served me well here. So I would just say, be patient, Michael, be patient. I never gave up, never give up. I've been training, I had some injuries that I handled, but patience. That's what I would tell my impatient self.
And I'm the same. And this is an important learning point to hear, I guess, of context of I've been training kind of just over a year, maybe a year and 2 or 3 months or so now. New guy joined the gym a few weeks ago, and he's frigging massive, really strong. And you take one look at him, me next to him, and you think he just batter me. Well, a year's worth of training and comfortably just manipulate him, control him, do whatever I like to him. But before that moment, everyone else I've been training with has been training for a similar amount of time as me. And so everyone's making the same progress. So everyone's really competitive. So I think there's value in, and I'm kind of adding to what you said there, Michael, but perhaps there's value in taking a step back every now and again, taking a breath, maybe having a glass of wine, celebrating where we've got so far. And yeah, just having that bit of context, because as long as you're making that steady progress every day and you're being patient, you're going to end up in the right place. And with that, the final question that I ask everyone that comes on the show, and I've asked you this in the past, if you could go back in time and speak to your younger self, what would be the one piece of advice you'd give him to help him become better at selling?
Yeah. Don't try to be anybody that you're not. I know early on I tried to be, this other sales guy, or to present myself as the this or that. Be yourself. People know who you are. People want you to be yourself. Be yourself. And the other thing I do is tell myself is to have fun. Have fun. If you're having fun, the sales will come. So be yourself, have fun. And if you're doing those two things, you're going to create some amazing results.
Final thing on this, how do you make, especially if you've got, you're booking keynote speeches, you've got a gap in a month, and you go, oh shit, I've got to pay my bills, I've got to get rocking and rolling on this. How do you make that fun? And this could be a whole episode in itself, I guess, but how do you turn that from drudgery of prospecting to something that's self-entertaining?
Well, it's interesting, man, because what I'm doing now, I'm up, it's the morning time now here. I've got my whole day plan. I get excited, dude, by prospecting, right? I love the biz dev stuff. To me, that's exciting. So I would say this, right? If you're not excited by what you do, you got to take a close look at that. So if there are July and August are slow times, it allows me to train more jiu-jitsu maybe in those times. But I love what I do, man, because in the past, I wasn't authentic with myself, and I was trying to be somebody I wasn't. And if I did have those slow times, it might cause me to reflect and be miserable because I knew I wasn't being authentic. But now it's just man, I'm being more of me, and more of me wants to go train jiu-jitsu now. And then I'm going to come back and get on the phone with 10 prospects and tell them about, these great principles and how that can change their lives. So that's the key, find something you love to do and keep doing it. Damn it.
Amazing. I know for me, final thing, I just have to do bigger deals. If I'm feeling bored, if I don't want to do prospecting and I'm doing deal sizes with the sales school, for example, at the moment, perhaps it's 10 people on a team. I need to start targeting enterprise organizations with 100 people on a team, which is what I've just started doing this week, because that then gets the juices flowing, and you're constantly on that step ladder upwards, right? Rather than just kind of on that level playing field, on that plane. And going back to what we kind of started the show with, of how humans are wired to help people, I feel like you get to a certain point, and there is a name for this in kind of psychology, and it's been well studied, of you get to a point and then you reach a plateau, and then your dopamine, serotonin, everything levels out. You have to keep pushing to get that next kind of step of all those neurochemicals. Hedonic adaptation, I think it's called, and it works with everything. You get a nice BMW, you've got a BMW, then you get a nice Porsche, you got a Porsche, then you have to get a Ferrari, and it's just the way that the human brain is wired to push people to success and to succeed. So yeah, that's what I would advise everyone to do. If you're feeling a bit bored, if you're not as happy as what Michael is right this second, who's clearly crushing it and excited about prospecting, then you need Jiu-Jitsu, Brazilian Jujitsu, and bigger deals. With that, mate, I want you to tell us a little bit about the keynote speaking, so we can add context to that, and anyone who's listening can potentially bring you in and use what they've learned in this show to kind of use that as a starting point to train their teams through you, and then where we can find out more about you in general, Michael.
Sure, Will. So as a keynote speaker, I work with sales teams to show them how to make better decisions to be better salespeople. And again, I rely on martial arts principles to show people how to make better decisions, to be a better salesperson. And, I speak at a lot of sales kickoffs and sales managers meetings and leadership meetings. People can find out more about me at my website, michaelveltri.com, because as a salesperson, I love speaking to other sales teams.
Amazing stuff. Well, I'll link to the website, everything else over at salesman.org for the show notes to this episode. And with that, Michael, I want to thank you for your time, your expertise and all of this, for the off-camera back and forth that we have over jiu-jitsu and the interesting stuff that you share with me. I appreciate that, mate. And I want to thank you again for joining us on the Salesman Podcast.
Thank you, Will. It's my pleasure.